January is bringing some big changes for us here at Ag Week TV and Ag Week Magazine. We're going to say goodbye to Mikkel Pates after a long and very stellar career in ag journalism. Quickly, you went to SDSU for ag journalism.
I graduated in 1979. I went to the Worthington Daily Globe for my first job. I had been an intern at the Farmer magazine in St. Paul the previous summer, but now I was in full-time work, and it was an interesting time in agriculture. There was still a lot of go-go 70s kind of thinking. They were trying to grow as much as far as they could and plant fence row to fence row, but that was soon going to take another turn.
Now, what I remember is the Jerusalem artichoke story. That was kind of the first big sort of ag journalism and investigative journalism that came together, and it's what kind of got you noticed by the Forum.
Right. This was a company in the Marshall and Lind, Minnesota area that had South Dakota connections. Ethanol was being thought about in those days, and ethanol was being talked about as being something on farms. So every farm was going to have an ethanol still, and but the Jerusalem artichoke people, farmers were starting to feel the pressure of the control over inflation, which meant rising interest rates. And so the ones that had done so well in the 70s had money, and this was a way to get into a new crop that was sort of a miracle crop. It had the Jerusalem moniker, so it had that kind of a religious connection, and that's how they marketed it, as a red, white, and blue nationalist agriculture and farming situation where you'd invest in this and buy seed. It was really a pyramid scheme, and
not a miracle.
No, it wasn't. And in fact, they'd never made anything like ethanol out of Jerusalem artichoke. Their theory was they'd grow the pyramid until they had so much of it that somebody was going to be able to make it into ethanol. But they had no market, and I think they extracted $20-some million out of farmers' pockets as far as up in the Grand Forks area, Manville area. There were farmers that I ran into later that were in Jerusalem artichokes. But I wrote a story about it at Worthington that they didn't like. I think they had 25 things they wanted retracted. And I had connections up at the Forum, and actually on my honeymoon we stopped and visited with Joe Dill and Terry Devine, who were being threatened with a suit on this topic, a different kind of story, but eventually they got indicted by the Minnesota Attorney General, and a couple of them went to jail, and when they needed an ag reporter at the Forum, they called me, and I was very happy to come up here.
And then through the 80s, of course, a lot of coverage of the farm crisis.
Yes, in 1983, October of 83, I came here, and the last story that was happening down in southwest Minnesota, I didn't get a chance to cover it because I was leaving town, was a couple of farmers that got bushwhacked by a couple of ag lenders that got bushwhacked by former farmers and killed. But when I came up in October, it was still fresh on people's minds, the Gordon Call shooting of the marshals out at Medina, North Dakota. He was a former farmer and was a farmer, and they had problems with, they didn't want to pay income tax and wanted other people not to pay income tax. Eventually this came to a head, but it was some of the same economic pressures that all farmers were involved with. And there had been tractorcades to Washington in '78 and '79, and I had done some coverage of that, but there was tractorcades in North Dakota, out in Jamestown, and there were big farmers going broke and going through bankruptcy, and so I would cover these bankruptcy cases and learned a lot of, lawyers that were dealing with this and saw how things didn't work. And also about that time, Sarah Vogel was suing the Farmers Home Administration and actually had a foreclosure moratorium for several years until the '87 Farm Credit Act, and that was something I covered at the forum as well. And you had senators like Mark Andrews were involved in Washington in the Ag Committee, and a lot of involvement with federal policies to help people climb out of the farm credit crisis.
So during that time, you were a reporter, ag reporter for the Forum, and then in 2000, you joined Ag Week magazine.
Right, and so in 2000, the Herald in Grand Forks owned Ag Week. Later, let's see, they had created Ag Week in 1984, and I had tried to compete with Ag Week, which had a lot of ag journalists, and I applied for an opening there, and it was great that they hired me for that, and it's been an interesting career at Ag Week.
So what other stories stand out to you from those days into the 90s and early 2000s?
Well, the 90s was a period of people trying to recover from the 80s crisis. I guess you go back a little bit farther to 86 and 87. There was a big drought, so on top of the farm credit crisis, there was a weather problem. And in the 90s, it was essentially people trying to find some enthusiasm again for this career, and you had debt write-downs from the Farm Credit Act, and you had people trying to get into value-added things. So there was the 90s were sort of a flurry of co-ops that were created. The Dakota Growers Pasta Company. There was Spring Wheat Bakers. There was the adventures into corn processing and things, people building corn ethanol plants. The ethanol industry took off as, people tried to invigorate the rural area. So there was a lot of that stuff. There was oddball things like the leopards from Dickey, North Dakota, going down to meet, people in Missouri to learn how to do homeschooling of kids, and that turned into a huge custody
Sort of a family
issue.
kidnapping.
Yeah, it was a kidnapping, but after they'd lost custody of their kids, and so it was farms in kind of a flux. And some of those co-ops and ideas didn't turn out, and but others did. There was also the Bison Co-op out in Carrington, and New Rockford came into being, and just exciting things like that. Kent Conrad, the senator, and Sarah Vogel, who became Ag Commissioner, held these annual events called Marketplace, and you would learn about all the people that had these small businesses that would turn into something or not something, depending on their how ingenious it was. But
People were trying things.
they were trying things, and that was good to see.
So many great stories to share after more than 40 years in ag journalism. We're going to hear more from Mikkel, including about his Ag Week TV career, coming up in future weeks.